Hello everybody, my name is Fernando Espi and I am a psychiatrist working in Chicago, and today we're going to discuss the meaning of the word Hispanic. As a Spaniard living in the US, people often ask me, what is the difference between somebody from Spain and somebody from Hispanic America? What is the difference between Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino? So today we'll try to elucidate that. It is important to know that the concept of Hispanic or Latin or Latinx originated in the area called the Iberian Peninsula. So back in antiquity, the area that today is known as Spain and Portugal was known by the civilizations as the Iberian Peninsula. And at that time, the peninsula was mainly dominated by Iberian cultures in the southeast and the Mediterranean Sea, and also by Celtic cultures in 2/3 of the more west region. So it would be more like the west of Spain. So the east was dominated by Iberian culture, and the west of Spain and Portugal was dominated by Celtic culture. This Iberian Peninsula also suffered or had invasions and colonizations from other cultures, such as the Greek culture that founded colonies at the Mediterranean Sea, like the colony of Ampurias in the area of Catalonia or near Barcelona nowadays, and also the Phoenicians through the Carthaginians, the people of Carthage in Tunisia. They also were cities and colonies founded in the Iberian Peninsula as well. So the Iberian Peninsula, this area of Spain and Portugal, had different cultures, different language, and there was a coexistence of different civilizations as well. During the 3rd century, before the Common Era, the Romans conquered the Iberian Peninsula, and they called this Iberian Peninsula Hispania. Hispania, it is thought to have actually a Phoenician origin. The word Hispania is thought to come from Hispania, that would mean the land of rabbits. So technically or potentially, a person who is Hispanic or Hispanic could be a person that comes from the land of rabbits. Rabbits, the animal, the rabbit. Maybe they found many rabbits at the time. Even nowadays, there are rabbits there. So that's just a thought or a hypothesis of the origin of the word. So Hispania was the name for the province of the Iberian Peninsula under the Roman rule in the Roman Empire. And these Roman people brought their culture and their language that was soon assimilated. So as such, the Celtic languages and the Iberian languages and the Iberian culture and Celtic culture and even the Greek and the Phoenician were abandoned, and eventually people learned Latin and learned to speak the Latin language. This is the origin of Latin or Latino, and they learned it, or Latinx, as we would say nowadays. And this language became the prominent language, not only in Hispania or Spain, but all over the Roman Empire, that also included North Africa as well, and all the Mediterranean Sea, all the areas around the Mediterranean Sea. What happened in the Roman Empire is like now we have a province that is Hispania, that originates and also has unique characteristics in the Roman Empire. In the late period of the Roman Empire, the Roman religion usually is largely abandoned, and Christianity and Judaism and other religions that came from the Middle East, the Semitic religions, start to become more popular in the Roman Empire. As such, there was a Roman emperor that was originally from Hispania, from the area of the city that we know, Segovia, called Theodosius I, that this Roman emperor declares Christianity as the official religion in the entire Roman Empire. But Judaism continued to exist in all the Roman Empire. So because this religion, to an extent, Christianity was coming from this religion. So now we have in the Roman Empire, we have the Christians, but also we have the Jews at the same time, and other sects of Christianity that originated from Catholicism as well. During the fall of the Roman Empire that happened at the end of the 5th century, beginning of the 6th century, we start having what is called the barbaric invasions. So in the area of Spain, we were invaded by different Germanic people. But of those Germanic people, the ones that stand out the most are the so-called the Visigoths, the Visigoths, the Visigoths. And these people were originated, or were thought to be originated, from the area that is now today known as Sweden. So anachronically, we could say that the Visigoths were coming from South Sweden. And these people from South Sweden migrated to the Germanic territories and eventually dominated other areas of the Roman Empire, but eventually settled in the Iberian Peninsula, known also as Hispania at the time. So at that time we have an idea of unity in that territory under the Christian rule. And the Jewish people continue also to coexist with the Visigoth people that originally had a different Christian religion called Arianism, that were people who where this religion was originated from the time of Constantine the Great. But this religion believed that Jesus was not as important and the Saint Spirit were not as important as God, and God was more important than Jesus and the Saint Spirit. But eventually these Visigoth people embraced Catholicism, and Spain became a homogeneous country in which Latin was the most commonly spoken language, and also Catholicism became the dominant religion in the Hispanic province under this Visigothic or Gothic rule during the 6th and the 17th century. At the beginning of the 8th century, then there were started having relationships with the Umayyad Islamic Empire. So at that time, Muhammad had founded this new religion called Islam and started becoming the dominant religion in the Middle East and eventually in all North Africa, and this is what we call the Umayyad Empire at the time. And this region of Hispania, that at the time was conquered by the Visigoths, became conquered by the Umayyad Empire, and this region of Hispania changed its name for Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is a word that was thought to be Visigothic as well. That means Landalux, and Landalux comes from the area of lottery, because there was a lottery and they divided this area by lottery. So that's what Landalux means. And Andalusia, which is a region in Spain, comes from that, from Al-Andalus or Landalux, which was a Visigothic name. What happened during the time of the Islamic rule is that Latin becomes less practiced and less used, and Arabic in the Spanish region during the 8th century starts to become the more commonly spoken language. Nonetheless, some of the Christian people that remained in North Spain, in the northern territory, they identify themselves with the Latin language and the Catholic rule, and they continue to resist, or we could use the word resist, in the 8th century in northern Spain, an area called Asturias, which is still a region in Spain nowadays. So these people preserve the culture of the Visigoth. Actually, most of the names that we use in Hispanic culture or in the Spanish language are originally Visigothic. Names like Gustavo or Gonzalo or Fernando, which is my name actually, or Guzman or Carlos are originally Germanic names that remain from this Visigothic culture that had remained or resisted during the 8th century in North Spain. And for over 700 years, these Christians that remain in North Spain, that had a remembrance as a memory of the unity of the whole Iberian Peninsula under the Christian rule, they start taking back and reconquering, which is called this area, this era is remembered as the Reconquista. It's named the Reconquista, which means the reconquering of the regions that were originally Christian and that had been taken by the Islamic territories and the Islamic Empire. And that takes about 700 years, more or less. And what we start seeing in the Iberian Peninsula is the formation of different kingdoms. So we have the kingdom of Aragon, the kingdom of Navarre or Navarra, or the kingdom of Castile, which becomes the most prominent kingdom in this area, and also the kingdom of Portugal. So these 5 kingdoms with different monarchs start to try to take back over 700 or 800 years the different territories that once were Christians and now have been taken by the Islamic people. And in these kingdoms, we start seeing Christian people and also Jewish people that had also were incorporated in the Christian kingdoms. So the people, when the Christians were taking an Islamic territory, the Jews could decide whether they could go join the Muslims or also join the Christian. So these Christian and Jewish people that were Hispanic Roman start to form part of the new kingdoms of the area that would later become as the Hispania again, or the idea was to take the whole Iberian Peninsula of Hispania again under the Christian, to be taken as a Christian territory. And for that they got a lot of help from the European territories that were also providing with warriors and with knights and with people who were interested in recovering all Europe or taking all Europe under the Christian rule as well. So in 1492 was a very important moment for the history of Spain, because at that time the Catholic monarchs, Fernando and Isabella, they were the kings of the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, and they decided to marry. And this is most of the territory of the Iberian Peninsula. Later on, the kingdom of Navarra would join in 1512. And in 1492, together, the Catholic monarchs conquered the last Islamic kingdom of Granada. So that's the formation of Spain that we still see in the Spanish coat of arms. We still see the representation of the Kingdom of Granada, Castile, Aragon, and Navarra together. The Kingdom of Portugal never joined this project and stayed as a different kingdom. So that's, even nowadays, it's still like that. We have Spain versus Portugal from this historical moment in which the Kingdom of Portugal always stayed separated from the rest of the idea of Hispania. So this Gothic or Visigothic idea of Hispania under the same rule continued under the idea of Spain, and that's the word of España. España comes from Hispania as well, or Spain comes from Hispania or Hispania as well, like we would say in the Roman time. The language was Latin, but this Latin language started to evolve in different languages all over the Christian territories, and that's the origin of the Italian languages, the different French languages, and also in the area of Spain we have different Spanish languages as well, and most of them come from Latin, such as the Catalan and the Galician. The Basque language in North Spain has different origins, because this is a language that existed before the Romans conquered the Iberian Peninsula. So it's a different language that doesn't have a Latin roots. But most other languages have the Latin roots. Even Romanian is a language that has a Latin root as well. So that year, in 1492, we had the release of the first Castilian grammar, and Castilian is equivalent of Spanish. Castilian is known as a Spanish language abroad as well. So the same year, 1492, Christopher Columbus started the expedition trying to get to India, rounding the world, but instead of arriving in India, it was an area they were trying to arrive in India to buy spices and use these spices, because the spices were sold for a very high cost or very high price in Europe. But instead of arriving in India, they arrived in a new land unexpectedly. He arrived there in the Dominican Republic. And once they arrived there, gradually they start to realize that they are not in India, that they are in a new continent or a new area. As described, this area is known today as America, because one of the cartographers that was with Columbus, that was with trouble with Columbus, was Americo Vespucio, and this Americo Vespucio or Vespucci passed the information to a German cartographer who decided to call this area America to honor him who had passed him that information at the time. Still in Spain, we used to call it West Indies until the 18th century instead of the name America. And what happened in this area of America? So gradually we start seeing that the Spanish language and the Catholicism are used as the tool to integrate these new people that are found there in America. So Catholicism and the Spanish language together, this Castilian language in which we had a grammar already in this Castilian language, become the two elements of integration of these new territories under the Spanish rule or the Spanish kingdom. So gradually the population the Spaniards who are arriving in America start to mix and interbreed with the local population there, which are the Aztecs or the Maya population or the Inca population. So they start mixing. So marriage is allowed between them, and they start. This is the origin of a new mixed race that we have there, or mixed ethnicity, as we would say nowadays, which is, it was called, the Spanish word for that is mestizo, but mestizo or mestizo means mixed. So we have a new ethnicity that results from the intermarriage under the Catholic rule. That, I mean, there are a lot of missionaries who start preaching the Catholic religion, and under the Catholic religion and the Spanish language, we start having a new mixed ethnicity that is called mestizo at the time, which are all the Native Americans who were living there. Later on, after the trip of Magellan and Elcano, who are able to run the world, people, Spaniards, are able to arrive in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, they start also mixing with the local population there. That is the Malayo and Polynesian. The Malayo and Polynesian people who were living there start mixing with the Spaniards who were arriving. And there is an elite of people there who start also learning Spanish. And also Catholicism is embraced as the religion. Again, we see Spanish, the Spanish language or the Castilian language, and Catholicism as the elements of integration. And we start having also other mestizo people who were mixed Spanish and Native American. We could say Native American because there were many different tribes at the time. These people start arriving also in the Philippines and in Manila. Philippines is because Philip II was the king of Spain at the time that the Spaniards arrived. So we see this mix, and also Chinese population that starts going from China to work in the city of Manila, which is the origin of the first Chinatown in the modern era, we could see. And this, more or less, under this time in the 16th century, the frontiers of this area that we would call the Spanish Empire at the time, from a historical viewpoint, become stable, and now we have no new frontiers other than in Africa. We have the Ecuadorian Guinean people as well. Also, it is important that to mention that under the Catholic monarchs, which is the time that America is discovered, for the Catholic monarchs, it becomes very important that to create a Catholic homogeneous society in Spain and all over the empire. As such, the Jewish people or the Muslims were asked to either convert to Catholicism or to leave the territory. So this is the time that many Spanish Jews, called also as Sephardic Jews, leave Spain or Hispania, or Spain at the time, because there was already the kingdom or the country as such had been formed, or the nation as such had been formed to an extent. These people had to, the Spanish Jews, called as Sephardic Jews. Sephardic is the Hebrew word for Spanish. So Sephardic means Spanish in Hebrew. These Sephardic Jews go to North Africa, Turkey, and other areas as well. And many of them are now in Israel. And they carry with them, the Sephardic Jews, their culture. So still in Israel or in North Africa, the Jews continue to speak the Spanish language that they call Judesmo or Ladino. So if you read the text in Ladino or Judesmo, you can, and if you speak Spanish, you can understand everything, because it's originally is the same language. So this is another aspect of Hispanic that is important to know, and many people don't know about, because usually people think of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, they think of America, but sometimes they forget about the Philippines that were under the Spanish rule for 300 years until 1898. And also later on, the last kingdom that was, or the last territory that joined the Spanish territories was Equatorian Guinea in Africa. That happened later on in the 18th century. But still, if you go to Equatorian Guinea in Africa, people still speak Spanish. Psychiatrists in Equatorian Guinea, Africa, speak Spanish. So it's important also to mention another aspect, the slave trade. I want to talk a little bit about that. So in all America, we have globalization now. The Spaniards discover America, and they eventually take Mexico, all South America, and even the southern part of what we know now as the United States, like Nevada, Colorado, Texas, California, etc. Eventually they arrive in the Philippines. they figured out how to go back to Mexico in Acapulco through the Philippines. So that's the first globalization, the time in which there were trade between China and the Spanish territories in Mexico through Manila. And from Manila, the boats or the galleons used to go to Japan. And from Japan, they were going back to Mexico and Acapulco. And then from Acapulco, all the Spanish territory. And from Acapulco, all the trade that was coming from China starts going back to Spain and Europe and so on. So this is an important moment in history because it's the moment of globalization and international and globalized trade in the world as well. But also is a moment in which we start seeing the slave trade, which is one of the most embarrassing situations of human history. And what happened is, like in Africa, some Europeans, it was started by the Portuguese, started to have colonies in Africa and started to take advantage of civil wars that were happening there in order to buy other humans who were prisoners of these civil wars and sell them for workforce in America, especially. I mean, it will happen in other territories, but it starts to happen mainly in America. What happened is that in America, in the Hispanic America or Spanish America, the Indians could not be a slave, or the Indians, it was called Indians to the locals, to the Native Americans. After the efforts of a missionary called Bartolomé de las Casas, it was forbidden to enslaved native or Aztecs or Mayas, Native Americans in the Spanish territory. But despite all the controversies that it generated, it was somehow allowed to enslaved prisoners from Africa that were bought in a slave trade. So from West Africa, the Portuguese, later the Spanish tolerated that, and then the French and also the English started to buy human force there. And in the Caribbean, from the Caribbean, it starts distributed all over America in order to make them, force them to work in plantations. So these people, that is estimated that about 100 million people came over 300 years from Africa as a slave to America, start also mixing with the local population. And in the Spanish territories, a lot of people who mix with the Spaniards or with mestizo, which is either native or mixed between Spanish and mestizo, are called sometimes the mixing between a Spaniard and an African person would be called as mulatto. Mulatto was the Spanish word at the time. Some people have nowadays other connotations, but that was the word used at the time. So we see a mix of different ethnicities. We see people coming from Africa during the slave trade. We have, of course, the Spaniards and the Europeans who were arriving there. And we have all the local natives that were there. And also in the Philippines, we have the Filipino people, I mean, the Polynesian people there. We have the Chinese people. We have some Spaniards arriving there. And we have also some of the mixed ethnicity people that were coming from America as well. All that starts to happen in the Philippines as well. So it's important because nowadays people say, oh, depending on how you look, they want to determine whether a person is Hispanic or Latino or Spanish or European or Caucasian. But when we use Hispanic or Latino, usually we're not referring to you cannot refer to that, I mean, by physical features, because the physical features are very mixed, because we have people from Africa, we have people from Spain who were Christian or Sephardic Jews that went all over the North African territory, and many of them are now in Israel, and some of them are in the US as well. We have people from Spain that Sephardic Jews and other people who converted to Christianity and stayed in Spain because they embraced the Christian or the Catholic religion. We have people from Africa, from the slave trade, that started mixing with the local population as well. And we have the natives that continue to be natives and still preserve their culture and their language and their religion as well. And we have a very large population of mixed ethnicities from European, Native American, Polynesian, and African as well. So we have a very wide variety of different ethnicities with different culture. And the element of integration of these cultures and ethnicities at the time and for a long time was the Spanish language that everybody shares, a common history that starts in the 16th century, mainly 16th century until nowadays, a common history together of trade and exchange of culture. and also the Catholic religion that until more recently it was the dominant religion in the Hispanic or Latino territories. I want to say also something about the difference between Hispanic and Latino. Sometimes when I look at different articles, they say that Latino refers to geographical area, or Latinx, because Latino would be actually a masculine word, and that would include potentially the female population as well. So people say Latinx now as more appropriate, versus Hispanic, that is a more neutral word. And people try to establish distinction, like some people are the Brazilians, other people the Hispanic. I mean, Latino is anybody who potentially speaks a Latin language. So as such, it would be French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Italian, etc. But which are Latin Romance languages that come from Latin after the Roman Empire. But people say that that's not European, but it's very European. I mean, it's European as Hispanic. What happened is, like in the 18th century, the French people didn't like the idea of Hispanic America, because Hispanic America would be the Spanish or Hispanic territories and Brazil, that was Portuguese, which was under the Roman province of Hispania. But the French had also territories there, and they started to propose more the use of the word Latin America, so that the Spanish, Portuguese, and French could be included. And that's when the word Latin America, and eventually many Italians also arrived in the 20th century in Argentina. So the word Latin America starts to get more weight over the word Hispanic America. But it's not a native word. It comes originally from the Roman language, from the Roman Empire, from the Latin language as well. Then what happens is that in 1777, in 1776, the United States or the 13 colonies declared the independence, and after that they start their own empire as well. So they start to try to take as many territories as they can. So they start. I mean, they buy Florida from Spain. Eventually, they buy the Louisiana, or all the area of the Mississippi from the French, and they take it from the French. Then they start taking all the Indian nations, so all the Indian people in the far west of the area of Wyoming, the Dakotas, and so on. They start like pushing back the Indians and start taking all that territory as well. And eventually, in 1846, they declare the war to Mexico, and they pretty much take over Mexico, and they go to Mexico City. And in the trade in the agreement of peace, or the peace treaties, eventually they take 1/3 of the Mexican territory. So they take California, Colorado, Texas, and so on, and the Mexicans have to sign the agreement. So in this U.S. territory, we start having a lot of Hispanic people as well that were from before these areas start to become a part of the U.S. territory. And at the same time, in 1898, the United States declared the war to Spain, and they take Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines try to become, I mean, the idea was that they become territory also of the United States. What happens is, like, Cuba later declared their own independence, and the Philippines later, they are taken from Spain as a Spanish colony, but the Philippines later, they declared their own independence as well. And then Puerto Rico remained under the Spanish and then the U.S. territory, and they become U.S. citizens as a free associate state. Some people, a small minority in Puerto Rico now, they claim that they could still potentially be under the Spanish crown, after what happened, because there was never an independence on their side, and they have never got their own independence. But independently of that, we have to say that the Hispanic or Latino people, or Latinx people, living in the United States come from the people who were already there that decided not to go back to Mexico or not to go back to Spain when the Mexico declared their independence, and eventually when the U.S. conquered all that area or took all those territories after the war with Mexico, and decided to stay there and continue to speak their language and continue their culture and their ideas. For example, like Jerónimo, this Native American who spoke Spanish, and he was Catholic as well. So these people stayed there. But later on, during the 19th and 20th century, we start having new migrations. So we have, for example, after the US-Mexican War, we start having a lot of Mexican people staying there or going to the new territories. And we have Mexican migrations and Mexican waves because it's the closest territory in the United States, especially in the south of the United States, but also now in Chicago and in New York, and especially in California and in all the southeast United States. Mexicans nowadays form 64.9% of the Hispanic or Latino or Latinx people in the United States. You know, the Hispanic people, which are the second ethnicity in the United States right now. You have Puerto Rico that is taken in 1898 after the Spanish War, and that represents now 9.2% of the population. We have people from Cuba. Especially after 1959, with the communist revolution of Ernesto Che Guevara, and Fidel Castro, a lot of people who didn't agree with the regime of the time, they migrate to the United States as well, and now Cuban Americans are 3.7% as well. The Filipino people could be considered, Sephardic people could be considered, Ecuadorian, Guinean people in the US could be considered as well. And then we have many Dominicans as well in the United States, because after the coup d'etat of Trujillo, that became a dictator there in the 1930s, a lot of people started to migrate from the Dominican Republic to the United States in search of political stability or as political prisoners. And especially after the 60s, after Trujillo was assassinated, a lot of people started to migrate to New York and many other areas. And they account for 3% of the population as well. And then in the 70s and in the 80s, in the 1970s and 80s, many people, due to political instability and internal conflicts in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, and in Nicaragua, start to migrate to the United States as well. So we have a big percentage of Hispanic or people with a Hispanic cultural background that speak the Hispanic language, that may or may not have anymore, but may or may not have the Catholic religion as an element, and also that come from a multiracial, multi-ethnic cultural background, but together through this integration element of the Spanish language and the background, the cultural Catholic background, whether the person have the faith or not anymore, the person still preserve the cultural Catholic background, migrate to the United States and become the second ethnicity in the United States. And when we look at cultural psychiatry, what are the most important aspects to consider from a cultural psychiatry viewpoint? So one thing we see is that trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder and depression has been more often described in first-generation Spanish or Hispanic immigrants in the United States. I mean, I say Spanish or Hispanic equivalent. Nowadays, we would say Spanish for people from Spain and Hispanic or Latinx or Latino for people from America and so on. But as we have described, potentially all of them, even Sephardic, are equivalent terms from an etymological viewpoint. So it's important that studies sometimes address the difference between first generation and second generation. So in a first generation immigrant, you can see more trauma, especially if they are political prisoners or they come from areas where there is war or conflict. And that may not apply only for Hispanic or Latinx people. It may apply also for any person, any immigrant that comes from an area of conflict as well. In second generation, we start seeing more acculturation and more assimilation, and then we start to see more psychiatric disorders that are more similar to the general US culture, which we start to see more prevalence of suicide or substance abuse problems. And in the people who still believe in underprivileged areas, because if you come as an immigrant, first generation, many people are working class, so we can still see in their children higher school dropout and difficulty integrating the old with the new and so on, which are common challenges that we can see. So when people talk about you look at the studies that sometimes they look at a specific population, to say the Hispanic or Latinx people in New York or in Chicago. and you compare to the general population, you can see sometimes that there is under these Hispanic or Latinx people can be underprivileged as compared to the general population. But this is hard to extrapolate as well, because it may be also in part because it's related to being first generation. So if we compare to the first generation Italians in the 1950s or in the 1920s, or first generation Irish during the 20th century, and second generation, and we compare to these people who are also first and second generations, it would be interesting to see if we see the similar difficulties, the similar challenge, and also this kind of like our first or second generation Polish as well, to see the challenges that nowadays we are seeing in first or second generation Hispanic or Latinx, if we were the same that we used to see in first or second generation Italian or Polish or German, etc. So it's important because when you look at the research sometimes, I find it that it's confusing sometimes, because how do you establish the comparison group and so on. So there is some confusion in the literature, in my opinion. This is more of a personal opinion when I was reviewing the literature. It's important also to mention about the cultural bound syndromes. In the psychiatric literature, we see sometimes things like ataque de nervios, cólera, mal de ojo, miedo, espanto, susto. And these are cultural bound syndromes that were described in psychiatry during the 20th century, when patients who mainly spoke Spanish were describing some of the potential psychiatric symptoms. And as such, we have ataque de nervios. But ataque de nervios, what we see in these cultural bound syndromes is that we have direct translations in English word and even in other languages. So, for example, when you say ataque de nervios, that means a nervous attack, which is very similar to a nervous breakdown or a meltdown or a nervous meltdown, in which a person can have anxiety with associated somatic symptoms. So I don't know how we can find or identify this as a specific syndrome. In my opinion, it carries some difficulties and challenges when we talk about reliability of the diagnosis or reliability of the phenomenology of the syndrome, especially when we compare and we see that we have those expressions as well in other languages and in other cultures as well. So nervous breakdown, ataque de nervios, I see a clear equivalent. Also, people talk about cholera as anger or rage, anger or rage. I mean, that comes from Hippocratic medicine, that a person could have a choleric temperament from Galen. Galen described the 4 temperaments in which a person could be melancholic, choleric, sanguineous, and so on. I mean, sanguinolent, melancholic, choleric, and I don't remember right now the last temperament. Choleric, melancholic, sanguinolent. Now I have it in the tip of my tongue, but it's not coming. But it comes from Hippocratic medicine. When you say, and Galen, when he described in Roman medicine, I mean, well, he was a Greek physician, but he was in Roman times when he described the 4 temperaments based on the 4 humors. So when a person is choleric, it's described also as anger, enrage, and so on. And that's the word cólera. That is the Spanish word of that, actually. Mal de ojo is evil eye. I mean, I think in every culture we have evil eye as something that can be culturally descriptive. So I don't see a specificity and reliability in these cultural bound syndromes that have been long described in psychiatry. When we say susto, miedo, I mean, susto is panic, like you get scared. I mean, miedo is fear, espanto is scare or fear or fearful. So or pasmo, that means fearful as well, but I don't know fearful as a cultural bound syndrome. I'm not sure about this. I think this is more of people, in my opinion, and this, of course, there are several opinions, but these cultural bound syndromes are like psychiatrists who didn't speak the Spanish language and they were not familiar with these words, and they start describing this as a cultural bound syndrome. But for somebody who speaks Spanish and English, it would be very hard to see this as a cultural bound syndrome. Also, the Massachusetts General Hospital describes some cultural differences between Anglo-Saxon. I mean, Hispanic, actually the opposite of Hispanic. When people look at ethnicities from a US perspective, usually they classify Hispanic or Latinx as different as opposed to African American or Asian. But if we think culturally, Hispanic is Asian, is American, is European, is a little bit African as well. So we see different cultures and different ethnicities under the Spanish language and Catholicism. So as such, it's opposed to non-Catholic, which could be the Protestant, maybe, or is opposed to people who don't speak Spanish, like English. So Anglo-Saxon would be opposed to Spanish or Hispanic, or Protestant, or would be opposed to Catholic, if we use Catholic as an element of the expansion of the empire, despite we could potentially consider the indigenous people who still practice shamanistic religion Hispanic in a wider sense, or Sephardic Jews that were from Spain, they were Hispanic Romance people in the 4th, 5th century, who embraced Judaism instead of Catholicism or Christianity, and these Hispanic Roman people living in the Iberian Peninsula embraced this religion instead, but eventually they decided to leave Hispania in 1492, when the Catholic monarchs declared Catholicism the official religion as well. So in the Massachusetts General Hospital, they describe some aspects that are important to consider. And one of them is, they say that in Anglo-Saxon culture, we tend to see a more nuclear, family-oriented people, which we may see in Hispanic and Latinx as well in 2nd or 3rd generation. I guess my great-grandchildren will have more of a nuclear family-oriented, but it is true that in 1st and 2nd generation, we tend to see more ties and connections to extended family. Nonetheless, I don't believe this is only specific or Hispanic and Latino. This is something we can see in Arabic or Muslim cultures. This is something that we see in Indian culture as well. This is something that we see in 1st generation immigrants also coming from other Catholic countries, such as Italian 1st generation, French 1st generation, even German Catholics 1st generation as well. We may have seen closer ties to extended family and relying less only on the nuclear family, as we will see in Anglo-Saxon. So I don't see this as something specific of Hispanic or Latinx. They describe also in Mass General book that in Anglo-Saxon culture they do not emphasize supernatural forces, and then they describe the Latino or Hispanic or Latinx and Hispanic as people who emphasize supernatural forces or a spiritual approach to the understanding of the world. And they mention saints, the use of saints. I mean, saints, I'm not sure. I mean, saints is something of the Catholic culture. So the Protestant culture, they argue that the use of saints is not good. And saints and images and art history, I mean, all the art history is a Catholic art history. But in the Protestant culture, we don't see images and saints and so on. And it's true, like veneration or adoration or veneration of the saints might be more typical of Catholic culture. But I don't think this is something typical of Hispanic or Latinx. The use of saints and rely more on the spiritual. This is something you can see in Polish, in Irish, in Italian, in Catholic Germans. I don't see something this specific or culturally specific. But also, it may happen more often in the Hispanic as compared to Protestant religion. That doesn't mean that you don't believe in science or you don't rationalize the world. Of course, you rationalize the world as well, but from a spiritual viewpoint, you rely more on these things as well in the Catholic culture in general, which is Hispanic, mainly Hispanic, and Latinx is Catholic. In Anglo-Saxon, they emphasize autonomy from parents. Like people they have more individuality and autonomy. And as compared to that, in the Latinx Hispanic culture, we see more respect for parental authority. I mean, I think in the Anglo-Saxon culture there is also respect for parental authority. Of course, you respect your seniors, you respect the elder. That might be more overly emphasized in the Hispanic culture. But I think this is something that in the Anglo-Saxon culture, if they don't have it, they should start trying to learn it as soon as possible. We should have respect for our parents and our seniors, of course. That's something very important. In the Anglo-Saxon culture, they describe also that there is more direct communication as opposed to the Hispanic culture in which you see more indirect communication, and people talk more in third person metaphors, jokes are more common, and indirect communication is more common. It's possible. I mean, I find myself using many metaphors and jokes all the time at work. I'm joking all the time at work. It's true, we love to joke a lot. We use sense of humor a lot. And I think that's certainly possible. It's something I was not aware of, that I find myself doing a lot more than my Anglo-Saxon, culturally Anglo-Saxon co-workers. I find myself joking a lot more, using metaphors a lot more. And I think that's something that we could, contribute to the Anglo-Saxon culture. They also mention the Anglo-Saxon culture as the more business-like and task-oriented, Latino culture as more personalized, emotive, person-oriented. It might be as well. I mean, the Hispanic and Latinx, we are seen as more emotional, emotive. We relate more. We are more sensitive, and it may happen also this more often in all the Latin languages as well. Like you can see that more in France. You can see that more in Italy and in Southern Europe in general. Even in Greek culture, I think you see a lot more of that as well. So this is certainly possible, and it's something that may happen as well. They mentioned the word machismo as patriarchal society. That is something that I got a little bit enraged and frustrated when I was seeing that. I was like, patriarchal society, machismo? What are you talking about? I mean, like, this may have happened in the past. And it may have happened in people with less education and less culture. But if you go to Spain is mainly a very feminist country right now. I mean, people blame the patriarchal society, but I think that's not a problem of Hispanic culture. That's a problem all over the world, having a male dominance in society and having no real equality between men and women. But I think in the Hispanic culture, especially my experience in Spain, we are doing a pretty good job with that, and we continue to make a strong effort. I mean, if you look at the law in Spain, there is a law that tends to favor the elimination and the abolition of the patriarchal society as much as possible. And I don't see myself, I mean, I come personally from parents who both of them were working and high functioning, and I don't believe in anything of that. So that's something that it can carry a negative connotation, and I would recommend the Massachusetts General Hospital book of cultural psychiatry to remove the word machismo from that, because I think it can carry, with all the respect that I have for the Mass General Hospital, which I believe is one of the best hospitals in the US and one of the best, they have some of the best psychiatrists, but I would remove the word machismo from a typical Hispanic culture, because I think that doesn't fit anymore in the culture. It's important also to mention, just to end, that the second generation or third generation, they start also embracing the Anglo-Saxon culture and the African American culture. So nowadays we see Hispanic people who are second or third generation, but they start incorporating a lot of cultural ethnic elements from Asian, African American, and Caucasian as well. So it becomes even more complex, because you come from a multi-ethnic, multiracial, that was always multi-ethnic, multiracial culture, and now they start people learning English, but the Spanish language is still preserved many times in second generation, and we start having first generations Hispanic, Latinx people that continue to come and preserve the language. Spanish becomes the second language in the United States. The United States starts to become more and more aware also of their Hispanic ancestry, especially in the southern state of the United States, but also we see more Anglo-Saxon people who embrace elements from the Hispanic and Latinx culture, and that they try to learn Spanish as well. So there is not so much emphasis in everybody learning English and forgetting their Spanish. Now there is more emphasis in the United States as a bilingual, by multicultural, multilingual, but especially for Spanish and Hispanic, is becoming more and more bilingual and bicultural as well. Of course, embracing all the different cultures all over the world. So the United States used to be an Anglo-Saxon, a country with 13 colonies that were mainly Anglo-Saxon, but gradually with all the migration waves and the growth of the Hispanic and Latinx community, is becoming more and more Hispanic and more Latinx, and of course incorporating all the cultural exchange of ideas of the Hispanic and Latinx and the African American and the Asian cultures as well. So this country is becoming like Spain was in the 16th century, like a very multi-ethnic, multiracial culture with the elements of union. And these elements of union are not the religion anymore, but they are sometimes the English and lately a little bit the Spanish language as well, and also what people say the embracement of the Constitution and the American values. So people who live here, they embrace the American values of freedom and liberty and so on, and also they embrace the Constitution and they embrace the American way of life as well, but also they come from all these multicultural backgrounds that enrich the US culture. And at the same time, the Hispanic and Latinx people that come here, they embrace the Anglo-Saxon culture, African American and Asian culture as well after 1 or 2 generations. So this is a very exciting moment to be in the world now, because we are seeing, especially in the United States, it's a very exciting moment to be, because we're seeing again a country that is embracing the good from many different countries as well. So thank you so much for your attention. And I hope to see you again if I do any other lectures.